Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started with this year's first IDSS Distinguished Speaker Seminar Series. Just since it's the first one of the year, I'll introduce myself. I'm Dean Eccles. I'm faculty in Sloan and also one of the associate directors of IDSS, and I'm the faculty organizer for this seminar this year. So I think we have a whole number of really excellent speakers spanning a bunch of the different areas that IDSS is interested in, and that very much includes our first speaker. So it's really my pleasure to introduce Andrey Fradkin, who's faculty at Boston University in Questrom. And a lot of Andrey's recent work has kind of been getting at questions of how platforms are affecting the economy and society, especially, I think, around affecting who's able to enter, small entrants, like what's the effect of Airbnb on consumer welfare, what are the effects of platforms surfacing occupational licensing in cases where that may or may not be needed. And I think this is going to be a really interesting exploration of that as well. And there's also some kind of cool tools involved in some of this that people might be interested in. So anyway, without further delay, let's welcome Andrey.
All right, can you hear me well? All right, excellent. So thanks so much for the introduction, Dean, and for all of you for joining the talk. I should mention that I am very happy to take questions in the middle of the talk. I prefer that rather than talking the entire time, so ask away, but not on the first slide. So this is a very early stage work. So it's a great time for feedback as well. I haven't really presented this very much. It's joint with my frequent collaborator, Chiara Farnato at HBS, and my colleague, Tesseri Lin. All right, so what is the motivation for this topic of study? I think given where we are, we understand data is really important, okay? In case you needed some hard empirical evidence that data is important, there's a bunch of literature on this, so for firms, they're going to use data in a variety of ways. A particular interest in a lot of the literature on privacy is its role in advertising and in personalized advertising, but also can be used to personalize algorithms. Secondly, consumer data might be very personal, and it could be used inappropriately. There are kind of famous anecdotes about this, like data being used to detect whether someone is pregnant or not. And I think motivated by some of these concerns about privacy in particular, there have been a bunch of regulations, both at a government level, so I'm thinking about GDPR in Europe or CCPA in California, but also private corporate efforts to kind of constrain the ways in which data is acquired and used by companies. And so recently we have had Google trying to deprecate third-party cookies and introduce an alternative framework called the Privacy Sandbox. And we've also had Apple implement the ATT policy, which has significantly reduced the amount of data that's used by apps on the iPhone. Okay? And I should mention here that there's a background concern with all these regulations that they might have some unintended consequences, and in particular on competition. Okay. Now, as these regulations are happening, one of the things that they're concerned with is consent. So they are going to require companies to obtain consumer permission to use the data. And consent is something that must be freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous. And requests for consent must be clearly distinguishable from other matters, and it must be clear in plain language. And data subjects can withdraw this consent. Okay, so that's kind of some of the current regulations about how to solicit consent. Now, firms are going to follow the letter of this law, but not necessarily the intent of this law. So there's something that oftentimes user interface designers are going to call dark patterns. that firms are going to use to obtain consent. So in the context of privacy, it's going to be a design that makes it hard for users to reject data sharing. So remember that most companies want as much data as possible, so they're going to set up their interfaces in a way that's going to maximize that consent rate. And so here is kind of some examples. So Le Monde, it has an accept and a cookie settings. Noticeably, there isn't a reject. Or you might have kind of by default, the sharing is on. Or other kind of interfaces where kind of it's the easiest thing to do is just to accept the cookies or to accept the tracking. Okay. So this is a very prevalent. So prior work suggests that about 60% of EU websites and about 80% of top 10,000 websites in the UK use such patterns. They're very easy to implement using consent management platforms such as OneTrust, CookieBot, TrustArc, and so on. You can imagine that these consent management platforms are running experiments all the time in order to maximize the accept rate. Larger companies roll out their own consent interfaces. They also run experiments to maximize consent rates. This is just something that companies do. Okay. So what are we interested in kind of with this introduction? So how do dark patterns affect consumers' privacy choices? So that's kind of the first order question. Now you might think, well, like, don't we already know the answer to this? Like, clearly they increase consent, but we don't actually know how much. And in particular, even if we had studies from specific websites, we don't have an estimate across the entire kind of internet. And kind of what we find, we look at a variety of patterns, and we find that simply hiding options has much larger effects than other sorts of manipulations, like much larger effects. So for example, hiding the reject option reduces, hiding the hiding the reject button increases the accept all by 5.3 to 7.9 percentage points. How do effects differ across websites and users? That's our other kind of big question. And why do we care about this? We care about whether regulations are going to affect competition. So if we pass a law that's going to differentially hurt smaller firms, that's going to have one effect. If it's going to differentially affect larger firms, that's going to have another effect. Now, it's not obvious ex ante whether dark patterns help or hurt specific firms. You can imagine that larger, well-known companies don't need to rely on dark patterns as much. On the other hand, you can imagine that they're more, maybe consumers are more impacted by their specific dark patterns that they're using. What do we find? We find that the effects of dark patterns are not correlated with website popularity, and that there's huge user-level heterogeneity. So some users are just not very susceptible to dark patterns. Others are quite susceptible to dark patterns. Yep.
Paradoxical for me. You're saying that these websites should not strategize for having more consent.
I never said such thing. Yeah, so let me just be clear. I mean, I think dark patterns, it might have some sort of negative connotation. I'm just using that term because that's a term that's used in industry for these things. I'm not taking a stand about how much data is good or bad. I'm just thinking about how data is acquired on the internet. Yeah.
Maybe a follow-up question there is dark patterns, is this sort of a good like conceptual scheme for thinking about the choices that firms can make to acquire consent, right? I mean, we might think there's a bunch of things that they could do to these consent dialogues that increase compliance,
and that we wouldn't necessarily label dark patterns, but some of them we might think are fine, but they also are optimizations that larger firms might undertake and that smaller firms might not, or something like that.
Yeah, so for sure, right? So you might have informative text about how the data is being used in a way that encourages people to share. I guess I would also say that kind of the other type of framework that one can kind of position these sorts of interfaces into is a behavioral economics framework where is kind of a nudge, and the nudge might work through kind of attention. It might work through kind of some additional costs of like clicking through something or trying to understand an interface. And that's something that we're kind of, we'd like to put a section in the paper where we estimate kind of a more behavioral economics model of this, but we don't have that yet. No. And then the last thing that we're going to study is choice fatigue. So especially in the EU, you're just getting these pop-ups all the time, like every time you hit a website. And there's a concern that if you're seeing this so much, you just stop paying attention to the choice at all. So we're going to have some experimental variation that's going to allow us to get at this as well. And we don't find evidence of choice fatigue, at least in our experiment. It's not to say there couldn't be choice fatigue that we didn't detect, but I'll show you the design of the experiment. All right, so roadmap for the rest of the talk. I'll talk about experimental design, some main results about dark patterns, choice fatigue, and then I'll conclude. Yeah. All right, so for this study, it's going to rely on a browser extension. That's how we're going to implement the experiment. We have an extension called Cookie Manager. It's based on the WebMonk framework that we developed. WebMonk is an open source extension framework that allows for manipulating the browsing experience, tracking user behavior, randomization, and prompting participants to do tasks such as filling out surveys. So we really hope that this can be used for a variety of projects in this area and not just for this specific project. Okay, so what is it going to do for this study in particular? It's going to create a cookie consent pop-up as users browse the internet. It's going to look something like this. When possible, it's going to enforce the choices users make by acting on any organic pop-ups that might show up. It's going to prompt users to finish surveys and to uninstall the extension at the end of the study. That's important for kind of IRB-related issues. And it's going to record browsing and cookie interactions, right? So we're going to be able to measure rich data as people are browsing the internet. Yes? So I think this kind of relates to incentive compatibility, right? We want the participants in our study to think that this is a consequential choice they're making, or at least as consequential as any other cookie pop-up. So we need to tell them that when they make a choice on our pop-up, at least some of the time, we're going to be enforcing that choice on the website. But how can we enforce their choice? The way we can enforce their choice is if there's an organic pop-up, we'll have the extension click on the corresponding choice in the organic pop-up, and we'll hide the organic pop-up. Now, our users are in the US. So in the US, cookie pop-ups are nowhere near as prevalent as in Europe. So we're not always able to do this. But when we can, we try to do it. So that's kind of the point. Yeah. Oh,
In
go
the
ahead.
absence of a cookie pop-up, is there anything about this that enforces data collection?
No, there isn't.
Okay.
And in the task, we say we try, but we're never saying that like we always enforce this. Yeah.
Sorry, so is this the case then that there are certain websites that don't actually organically have cookies, that there's like kind of this option that the cookie manager places? And in that case, that would kind of be like a non-enforceable thing, right? Because if it doesn't ask for your permissions, then there's no kind of like settings to organically fiddle with.
So I'll say that pretty much every website, well, not every, but every like notable website has this, but they don't always pop it up in jurisdictions that don't require it. So in Massachusetts, as far as I understand, not required. In California, it is required. So it depends on where the user is coming from. So if we have a Massachusetts user in our study, they're going to see this even though there isn't an organic pop-up underneath it. But that website definitely has the capability to offer an organic pop-up. Yeah.
URL analysis on.
The what data point?
Like that would is there any kind of filtering to get rid of kind of instances where when you're actually doing the data analysis from the results of your experiments, are you getting rid of the websites that don't have organic cookie managers, or the website user pairs that don't have organic cookie managers?
No, actually we're quite interested in the ones where there aren't organic pop-ups, because we're, in particular, you can imagine a US law that's similar to GDPR that would require these, so that's a counterfactual we're interested in. So, yeah. All right, so experiment design. So we're going to recruit US-based Chrome users through Prolific. They're going to start the intake survey, and they're going to install the extension. We're going to ask them to clear their cookies. This is kind of part of making the study more realistic. At least that's how we were thinking about it, because if you already have cookies, that's one of the things they'll track is whether consent has been asked and whether you've given it. So if they've cleared their cookies, then in principle, pop-ups can start showing up again. We're going to have two parts to the study period. The first part, people are going to visit 20 websites that we've chosen ex ante. And the randomization is going to be user by site. So we're going to randomize cookie interfaces user by site. We have this portion of the study because we would like to ask questions about users' familiarity with these websites as they're browsing them. And so that's kind of why we picked it. And also for having a very comparable sample across all of the users in our study. We are also going to have an organic browsing period for 7 days, where once again, we're going to randomize the interface user by site. There's going to be a secondary randomization, which is going to be about the frequency of the cookie pop-ups. They're going to be shown every 10 or 60 minutes. So the organic browsing component, we really wanted to see that as well, because you might think that people behave differently within the context of the survey than out in the wild when they're just using the internet as they normally would. And then there's going to be an end-line survey, and that's kind of the study. So there's also visual representation. So intake survey, install extension, delete cookies, randomization at the site level, an intake survey, finish intake survey, then organic browsing period, end-line survey, and uninstall the extension. Yes?
Was your research question apparent to the people who are participating? And did they know this is what you were studying? And number two, did you have folks do it just on a laptop, or was it a laptop and their mobile device?
Just on a laptop. Okay. So browser extensions, we can't really get them to work on a mobile device. In terms of whether it was apparent, I think they probably would have realized that we're thinking about cookie interfaces, but they probably weren't thinking about cookie interfaces in competition.
Yeah. Clarify this 10-minute, 60-minute.
Yeah.
What does that concretely mean? Is that within the same website, or I'm just not sure
Okay.
I'm getting what that means.
Great. So it's across participants. During the pre-selected 20 websites, it's always popping up. Now, as they're browsing organically, we didn't want to pop it up every time because we thought we'd annoy the users too much, especially kind of ones that we've recruited to keep this extension installed. And so we decided to show it up with essentially a frequency cap, either at most every 10 minutes or every 60 minutes. Now, so you might be getting at something related to what happens if you've already been asked this once for a domain. Would you be asked again? And the answer is you would not be asked again for the same domain because you've already made that choice for the domain.
So isn't browsing experience actually within both of those red boxes somewhat endogenous to what's happening? Like you can't actually say that like browse this website for 10 seconds and then click to this other website for exactly 10 seconds.
So for this part, I'll show you how we do it, maybe, and then I'll see if that addresses your concern.
Okay.
But here they're just, we don't tell them to do anything. They're just using the internet. It's endogenous because they have the browser extension installed, but yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I still have to think about how I think about inferences if it's like, but anyway, okay, I think once I see what that looks like, that will help.
Okay. All right, so here's how it looks like. So please use Chrome to navigate to twitter.com. So, search for a topic of your choice. And we kind of make sure that people click on the link. Once they click on the link, they'll be shown a pop-up. Then they're going to come back to the survey. We're going to ask them, do you normally visit Twitter, yes or no? If they say yes, we'll ask them how frequently. So that's kind of for us to analyze whether familiarity affects choice.
Do most users just click the link and then return to the
Yes,
survey?
yes.
So people aren't like, oh, and now I'll browse Twitter for a minute?
No,
Okay.
not really.
Cool. Yeah.
But I guess if they do normally visit Twitter, they might then, in the second study stage, visit Twitter again.
But we've already
and their
recorded it.
choice
This-
will have already happened.
yes.
Yeah, I see.
So we have kind of Amazon or Google, but we also have like DuckDuckGo or Popin or a website you haven't heard of. Just kind of, we wanted to get some of that variation, but of course with 20 websites, there's only so much inference you can do across websites based on that. Okay. All right, so then let's talk about the different interfaces. So treatment banner design. So deliberate obstruction or kind of hiding the option. That's kind of the most common pattern, I'd say. So we're just going to reject all cookies. Now, this design right here, we tend to call it kind of a neutral design, just because it has all the options, and the accept all is not even the topmost option. Okay, so now relative to this, we now don't have reject all cookies. Now we could also reorder the options, so we can move accept all to the top, reject all to the middle, cookie settings to the bottom. We could also highlight accept all and keep the others in gray. That's another pattern you might see. Now what happens if you click to cookie settings? You can make sub-selections and then click accept selected. I'll also point you to this X. So we put in this X here because a lot of consent pop-ups have an X that allows you to exit out of them. It turns out that people hit that quite a bit. So in total, we have 6 variants. Hide reject, hide accept, reorder. Well, this is neutral. This is reorder so that accept is on top. This is reorder so that reject is on top. And then this is the gray. And we have these kind of abbreviations that we tend to use. Yes.
First option, for instance, where there is no explicit option to reject, can they still like I was just thinking, what does it mean to hide? Can they still at some there in the browser extension do it? Or is it
Yeah, so they hit cookie settings and they unselect all of these. Yeah. Yes.
What do you log it as if they click the X?
We log it as a closed window.
Okay.
But it's a good question. So we can ask people what they believe X means. So I'll show you that. Yeah.
If they choose like reject all, can they still use the website?
Yes.
why isn't this a default mode?
Why isn't it default?
Yeah, I always like to share the least amount of data.
Well, our users don't always like to share the least amount of data. I mean, it's, you might be maybe typical of a person in this building, but not typical of the wider world. Yeah, yes.
It's a dark pattern that if you do reject all, it will continue to give you the pop-ups and won't like remember your setting. Is that true?
It might be true. I don't know. I don't have any data on that, but I mean, it seems plausible that they might do that. Yeah. I feel like, especially on apps, I've tended to notice that. Yeah.
As you are helping people who could reject all, like, do they know they can still continue to use that, or they usually can still reject all and not?
I mean, when we ask people about what they think cookies do, they tend to think that they're mostly about personalization. So I doubt that they think that it affects whether the website's usable, but I don't know. Yeah.
What is the cost sort of entail in terms of the cost that's made, and it might also be instructed to
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Can you speak a little bit louder?
Sorry about that. I was just asking what it entails in terms of the selection that's made, and then also it might be instructive to look at what users perceive that to be.
Yes. So I'll show you the results in that in just a second. Yes. Okay. All right. So results. Okay. So we started about 1,200 users. 900 of them were eligible in the initial screening. 600, a little more than 600 fully completed the study and generated the valid data points that we're going to use for the summary statistics. That's pretty close to our kind of what we were aiming for in the pre-registered study. It's hard to hit it exactly because we kind of put a number on prolific, and the funnel is kind of hard to fully predict. Okay, so in the prior week to them signing up, people tended to visit 51 unique domains. So how do we know this? Because you might be wondering, well, the browser extension is not installed yet. The browser extension actually has access to your browsing history API, which might be creepy, but it is true. And so we're able to observe this number. So about 51 unique domains in the prior week. Okay, now during the survey, the median person saw 20 domains with a banner. The mean is a little less than that. So we're doing a good job of popping up the banner for these users. Post-survey, they tended to see about, on average, 21 domains with a banner, although the median is 15. So some people aren't browsing organically as much as we would hope. The mean unique domains visited is about 77, and URLs is about 1,200. About 85% of them completed the N-line survey. Okay. So demographics in our study, the mean age is 38, about 50% female, 18% bachelor's or above. Okay. So I'll first kind of show you some visual evidence, and then I'll get to treatment effects. So the colors here, this dark blue is accept all, light blue is accept some, gray is close window, pink, red is reject all. So here we're comparing accept, reject settings versus accept settings. So that's where we hid the reject. That's kind of the only difference here. So we see more acceptance here. We see also more accept some, and a lot more close window. And then some people still manage to reject all, okay? So kind of an interpretation of that is that a lot of people substitute from reject all to close window when reject all is not available. With one click, that is, yeah. If we look at kind of a more mild manipulation where we just put the reject and the settings into gray, we do see a little bit of a difference, but it's a very subtle effect. If we compare the different orderings, so this is accept reject settings, reject accept settings, and settings accept reject, we kind of see that in accept reject settings, the accept all is a little bit bigger than in reject accept settings and settings accept reject. But overall, kind of compared to this difference, these are kind of much smaller differences. And then I think this is a very interesting one, although a little bit counterfactual, because I don't think any website would ever do this on purpose. So we're going to hide the accept option. Now, what was interesting to us is we actually thought that a lot of people would just hit reject and call it a day. And you do see a substantial increase in reject, right? But not all the way to just not all the way to 100% or anything. We see an enormous amount of people close out because they want to, the way we interpret this is they want to hit accept all, but they don't see it, so they just hit X. We see an increased amount that accept some, so they're going to go to that more settings option. And we do see some who manage to accept all even through all of that. Yes?
And it looks like accept than to reject even, right? Comparing the top.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, this gray is kind of, I don't think they're working hard in the gray, but I guess we could compare this to this plus this. So yeah, they're working. I'd say they do a little more effort. So I think that the most consistent explanation with this is kind of that the majority of people prefer to accept the cookies. I mean, that would be the very kind of standard interpretation of this evidence. Yeah. Okay. So let me kind of just show you some treatment effects because yeah. Okay, great. So for a lot of websites, there might not be very many benefits. But in general, you might get personalized advertising, or they might remember kind of your settings on a website, or you might get a personalized set of results if you go to a particular website. Those are kind of the things that might be done with cookies, yeah. All right, so treatment effects. So there are going to be 2 points for this. One is for the organic, one is for the survey. We see that in the accept reject. So the control category here is settings accept reject. Okay. So I should have put some more tick marks here. So this is a little more than 0.05 over here. So we see that accept reject, removing the this should say accept settings. So accept settings has a higher accept rate. Accept reject settings also has a higher accept rate. Reject accept settings doesn't have a higher accept rate, but doesn't have a lower accept rate either, actually. And then accept gray reject gray settings, that also increases the accept rate. So just kind of to summarize, things where accept is higher tend to have higher accept rates. The biggest effects are for accept settings. And then reject settings, you can see these huge negative effects on accept all.
The y-axis again?
The treatment effect.
So is that like the proportion of accept versus?
This is percentage points.
Oh.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's not percentage points, right?
You need to multiply by 100 to get your percentage points, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's not percent. It's, yeah. Okay. We can kind of decompose the treatment effects of accept settings. So I've already shown you this number. So when we do accept settings, accept all increases. Reject all actually decreases by a greater amount. And the reason is that there's some kind of additional substitution going to the close window option. On the other hand, when we have reject settings, we see accept all false. I've already shown you that. There's some substitution to reject all, but there is an even more substitution towards close window. OK, so now that we've kind of talked about the treatment effects, let's go back to this question about like what do people think about closing the window. So we see a significant proportion think that all cookies are accepted if you close the window. The majority of people think no cookies are accepted. And then we had kind of another text box, and some amount of people put answers here, although most of them actually could have probably been fitted into one of these two. But most people think no cookies are accepted if they hit close. And that's actually what our design was like.
Like if there was an organic pop-up and they hit X, then you treated it as a no accept.
If it was our pop-up,
Right.
and they hit X, we didn't do anything.
Oh,
I think
okay.
that, yeah.
I see. There was still an organic pop-up that.
No, I think we hid the organic pop-up. So I guess it could have been equivalent to the X, yeah. Yeah.
Like if you hit X on an organic pop-up, what it means you not actually.
Usually it means actually, this is an interesting question. I think it usually means you accept the cookies.
Yeah.
But it might depend on jurisdiction. Yeah. Yeah.
I guess my question is there a difference between like pressing the X button on the element versus just like, dev console delete the pop-up element, right? Like, does that, because like I'm assuming that's what like the cookie manager did when
Yes,
you hit X,
yeah.
right? Like you just deleted the element. In that case, like, is it still counting as accepting the cookies, or like?
I don't know. I guess in some sense, like the background mechanics about like what actually happened, whether cookies are accepted or not, is not something our study is about. It's about what people think is going on more. But yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. Yeah. All right, so let me show you a little bit of heterogeneity analysis. So actually, this table is not about treatment effects. It's just about baseline rates. Okay, this is answering a more descriptive question, like what determines, or like what's correlated with people accepting cookies for a particular domain. Okay, so in the survey period, we have survey-based measures of whether people normally visit a website and whether they've heard of it. And so when they normally visit a website, they're more likely to accept all, about 6 percentage points, so about equal to the effect of hiding the reject. And they are less likely to reject all. They're less likely to close the window. The heard of variable is kind of less. There's less going on there. We can also measure whether they visited a website in their browsing history prior to the study. And there we see a smaller effect size of 2.4 percentage points. And that's coming kind of from the reject all option. So if they visit a website, they are a bit more likely to share their cookies. And we see that also in the organic, although here, for some reason, the substitution seems to be coming from the close window rather than the reject all option. And then we also have a measure of website popularity. That's kind of a global measure. We see kind of that the less popular the website is, the less likely someone is to accept in the survey. But remember that the survey is just 20 websites. So there could be all sorts. I mean, in general, right, like we don't want to make causal inferences from these sorts of comparisons, but especially in the survey where we only have 20 pre-picked websites, we might not trust that this is really what's going on. If we look at the organic data, there's no difference in accept rates based on website popularity. So, which is not to say that, once again, there could be all sorts of other things correlated with website popularity that we haven't controlled for, but there doesn't seem to be some strong effect that's popping out of this descriptively.
Was just unconditionally in the neutral treatment, let's say.
I think it was around 60%.
60%.
Now, we also try to look for heterogeneity, treatment effect heterogeneity. So it's one question about like what predicts whether you accept. But there's another one is what predicts the size of the treatment effect. And we don't find that website popularity predicts the size of the treatment effect. So one interpretation of this is that the ability to use dark patterns or not is probably not going to differentially affect how much data a website can collect by using the dark patterns. So both types of websites are helped similarly by using one of these patterns. That said, that doesn't mean that there isn't heterogeneity by websites. It just might not be correlated very well with popularity. So we can actually plot the accept rate by our survey websites, for example, and we do see some variation. We can plot, for example, the treatment effects, and we see kind of higher effects on accept all for these websites like Mary Sky, which you probably have never heard of, or Seattle Times, and kind of smaller effects for Target, although of course the confidence intervals are quite wide here. Yes?
When we're comparing across websites, I don't know if it's like possible within the scope, there might be a notion of how important or time sensitive the task is. For instance, I just moved, and then if it's about finding when the next train is going to come versus ordering furniture, I might have, as a user, a different level of like tolerance for like accepting or rejecting. So is there like a notion of the type of service that the website provides?
Yeah, so it's great. So that's on our to-do list, is to have a better categorization of domains. I don't know if there's like one available that's like how time sensitive it is, but we could at least kind of categorize it. Is it search? Is it social media? Is it news? And so on. Yeah.
Walk you into this extension. The websites at the top here and trying to figure out like, maybe this is just me projecting, but I feel like they're websites where both I'm already giving them a fair amount of information, perhaps my credit card, and I want them to have my information because I want them to like serve me up the stuff I want to see. And I don't know what a Mary Sky is, so I'm skeptical, and I'm like, you don't have my credit card already. I'm also going to think about cookies more carefully there. Have you thought about extensions? I'm not saying go do more work, but where you actually vary how much other information they're thinking about giving to the website and see if that interacts with people's, like, are people thinking about this holistically as like, I trust this website, I already give it information, I want the personalization, or are they really thinking of cookies in a narrow kind of way, independent of whether they would input a credit card to that website and how they would think about it? Or maybe credit card's not the relevant thing.
No. I mean, yeah, I don't. Yeah, it's an interesting suggestion. I don't know what people are thinking about it. There might be something in the literature about that, because I know there are a few other papers that think about decisions to share different pieces of data separately. So there might be some evidence about whether, like, how correlated are those valuations for sharing, but I haven't thought about it in that. Yeah. Okay. Now, so we talked a little bit about website heterogeneity, but what about individual heterogeneity? So here are the average accept rates by participant in the neutral condition. So this is the settings accept reject. So we see that there's kind of a spike that's at 0 essentially. There's another spike that's a bit higher than 75%, and then there's kind of an intermediate amount. So kind of one interpretation might be is that some people they just want to reject whenever possible. Other people want to accept, although maybe sometimes they either misclick or they might hit close instead. And then there's kind of a more selective group that's really thinking about which website do they want to share with. So we actually asked people how they thought about their recent sharing behavior, and that's kind of consistent with what we saw. So we see some amount of people who rejected most, some who accepted most, some who chose based on website, some who chose based on website and cookie type, and some who chose based on cookie type. This is like a very tiny amount of people who always hit more settings and selected stuff there. So we can decompose that variation in a random effects model. So essentially we can have a random effect for participant, for domain, and some residual variation. And we see that the standard deviation for participant is about 0.35, whereas the standard deviation for domain is about 0.03. So participant variation is kind of explaining a lot of these cookie sharing choices. All right, so I'm just about out of time, so let me tell you a little bit about choice fatigue, and then I'll conclude. All right, so choice fatigue, I've already talked a little bit about this, but there's this problem about too many consent notices. The media likes to write about this, the revenge of the pop-up. Nobody wants them, nobody likes them. Why is the worst UI element of all time ubiquitous again? So as I've already mentioned, we have this kind of, in the organic browsing period, variation in how frequently the pop-ups could show up, 10 or 60 minutes. But before I get to kind of the results of that treatment, I just want to talk a little bit about how much time people spend on this. So let's focus on the organic columns. So in the emitted category, people tend to spend about 7.4 seconds on the pop-up. The only UI that substantially increases, at least we can detect increases the time spent, is the reject settings. This is kind of this weird kind of condition that no company would ever want. When we break it down by choice, we see that when people do accept selected, that's actually what takes the most time, unsurprisingly, because they have to do one more click and select some stuff there. Close window, interestingly, takes a little bit more time as well, although that doesn't show up in the survey evidence. So if we thought about opportunity costs of interacting with the banner, like if we thought about an hourly wage, how much time, what is the money value of time that people spend on the pop-ups? So we calculate if the pop-ups were there for all the domains on the browser, that would cost about $3.8 per week. Now, of course, the share of total internet consumption that these people have that's in the Chrome browser on their laptop is tiny compared to what they do on their phone, presumably, and elsewhere. So this number is actually likely to be substantially bigger. So it is wasting a lot of people's time. And then lastly, I'll talk about choice fatigue. So we're going to run a regression where the outcome is going to be accept all, reject all, or close window as a function of the 10-minute versus 60-minute pop-up. We're going to control for the time in the study, although the results don't change whether we control for that or not. We see that there is no difference in behavior depending on the frequency of the pop-ups. And in case you're wondering, well, maybe people are just not browsing that much, and that's why there's no difference, there is a substantial difference in the amount of pop-ups people see between these two conditions. So at least on the margin of 10 minutes versus 60 minutes, there doesn't seem to be choice fatigue going on. Now you might say, oh, this is a significant coefficient, time in study. Yeah, that is an interesting coefficient, but that could be due to a variety of other things, right? It's not necessarily causal. In particular, people may just be less engaged with our study and may not be trying as hard to think about our pop-up and might just close their window a little bit more often.
Just trying to understand
Yeah.
that endogeneity. One of the features of this is that if it's a website I visit frequently, I should encounter it early in the study.
Yes.
And so these websites I'm encountering later are ones that I use less frequently on
Yes.
average. So
Yes.
that may be
That is
driving most of that.
that's great. I have domain category fixed effects, but
Yeah.
you know, you're right that actually this shouldn't be showing up multiple times for domains. So that's a good point. Yeah. All right. So let me conclude. So design elements in interface make a difference, perhaps unsurprisingly. Hiding the reject option increases accept all rates by between 5.3 percentage points and 7.9 percentage points. So quite, substantially, I'd say. I think an interesting and unexpected finding for us is that when you hide options, there's a lot of substitution towards the closed window. And that's true regardless of whether you hide the reject or hide the accept option. So people are, if you make it harder for people to make their preferred choice, a lot of people will just close out. And then the other design elements have much smaller effects. We find heterogeneity in preferences across users and sites, with the most of the heterogeneity being due to the users rather than the sites. We find no evidence that more popular sites benefit from more dark patterns, and we find no evidence of choice fatigue. So what are the policy implications for, at least what we think? I think keeping the major options on the first page seems like pretty innocuous. Having some option that kind of defaults all users into one choice is unlikely to work well, just because users differ so much in what their preferred choice is. And some share of users, a substantial share of users, do make decisions depending on which site they visit. Since a lot of behavior hinges on this X, it could be helpful to clarify what that X means. That seems like also kind of pretty good to standardize. And then lastly, the time wasted can be substantial, so kind of smarter ways to help users make these decisions would be good for society probably. So I'll end with that, and thanks so much.
Cool. So we have time for a couple of questions, and then also there'll be a reception. So.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Super interesting. Is there any reason to believe that the interpretation of the X itself could depend on the treatment? As in, if I can only reject, then clicking the X might mean accept, and vice versa.
That's a good idea. I haven't thought about that. It might, yeah. I don't know if we have anything here that could answer that question for, but yeah.
So, although to Unity, my questions are mainly around ethics and research. So, if there's any data that could potentially be used for research, where IRBs are not considering consent of cookie data, what do you think are the policy implications for use in research? That's the first question. And the second one would be that if a user rejects the cookie data, but there's a pop-up window that keeps coming up, would that be regarded as a form of coercion if cookie data is being used in research?
I guess, can you clarify your first point? Like, and what do you mean by cookie data being used in research?
Need to be cognizant of the fact that they might also have to have some sort of waiver of consent documentation for cookie data in the event that researchers are using desktop-based research to extract data for research purposes.
So I guess like having filled out these IRBs, we specify all the data that we are collecting, and the requirement of the IRB is to explain to the user what data we're collecting. So like to me, it seems like that would be automatically baked into any IRB. Like there's nothing unique about cookie data versus other data that you need consent for. If that's kind of my understanding, but I'm not an IRB officer, so I don't have more insight over and above that.
I guess one further comment on it is that consent is a word that has a general meaning, but has specific technical meanings in different settings, which can be wildly divergent. So the notion of consent in GDPR may have nothing to do with the notion of consent in the common rule in regulation of human subjects research in the United States. And also, of course, that like most analysis of this kind of like large-scale data collected by websites via cookies is minimal risk research under which informed consent is typically waived.
I am on MIT.
Oh.
I just put a target on my head. I'm happy to talk within the limits of getting in trouble about how we're thinking about this kind of research. But
Yeah, maybe we could take that offline. But in terms of repeatedly asking for consent, I mean, it does seem like at some point you're hoping the user just clicks on yes to just stop the pop-up from happening again. That seems pretty coercive, yeah. Yeah.
Do you have an idea on the level of heterogeneity in terms of like geographic location? Because this is inspired by the Massachusetts and California comparison. Where you might already have something relevant to cookie setting, or implemented there, and would that somehow correlate with people's like reactions or choices and
Yeah, so we do have people's location. My hunch is that we don't have enough California users to really draw a strong statistical inference from that difference, but we can take a look. That's a good suggestion.
Sorry, I missed the start of this talk, so sorry this is something that was already covered at the start, but do you have any features about like the users or information about the users to help differentiate them? Because I feel like from a policy perspective, the fact that there's so much user heterogeneity is actually like a big deal, right? Because it means that like the people who might be most likely to accept cookies might be people who might not actually know what they are, and in some sense maybe we should be thinking about policy with certain subpopulations in mind beyond others, right? Sort of like the tech bros in California kind of know what cookies are. They make a well-informed decision about whether or not to accept them or not, but maybe other groups are more susceptible or have a false understanding of what cookies are.
Yeah, so we have some characteristics like demographics. We asked their income levels, gender. We didn't find differences between frequent acceptors and frequent rejectors on these demographic characteristics, but we just kind of scratched the surface of that. So that point is very well taken. Yeah.
I think since we're over time and we have a reception as well, that there's going to be more opportunities to ask Andrey questions then. But yeah, let's thank our speaker.